Let me say that I am delighted to be here today in Sweden, speaking to you about the great Swedish polymath and visionary philosopher, Emanuel Swedenborg. I do wonder, though, that in doing so, I am, as they say in the UK, and as Gavin said earlier, bringing coals to Newcastle. Surely, Swedenborg's importance as an Enlightenment figure, scientist, and religious thinker, and there he is. There's my little book on Correspondences, and the correspondences are between the earthly things and the celestial things, the spiritual things. But from the purely peripheral soundings I have made, I have the impression that Swedenborg is not rated that highly in his native land. Not as much as, say, he is in England, where he spent a great deal of time and where he died, as he predicted, on 29 March 1772, thus missing a meeting with the Methodist John Wesley. In a letter, Swedenborg told Wesley that spirits had informed him that he, Wesley, desired they meet. When a surprised Wesley admitted as much, not having mentioned a word of his wish to meet Swedenborg to anyone, and proposed a date, Swedenborg said that he would be unable to make it, as he would by then be dead. And he was. He was right. Swedenborg is an interesting figure to consider in the light of the question of disenchantment. He was, as mentioned, a figure of the Enlightenment, and he spent the first half of a long, prolific, and productive life. He was born on 29 January 1688 in the pursuit of knowledge, and made a name for himself in his home country and abroad as a scientist and engineer. He was well-versed and equally at home in chemistry, mineralogy, geology, anatomy, astronomy, and what we would today call neuroscience, having made discoveries in the last two disciplines well in advance of their later acceptance. His nebula theory, the formation of the sun and solar system, predated the more widely known Kant-Laplace version. And regarding the brain, Swedenborg was the first to recognize, among other things, the importance of the frontal lobes. I hope they're all working for you this afternoon, and the function of neurons. As a young man, he traveled through Europe networking with men of science in various capitals. He met Edmund Halley, the comet is named after, and he sat in on Newton's lectures, often living with craftsmen from whom he learned the skills of their trade. He started the first Swedish scientific journal, Daedalus Hyperboreus, or Nordic Inventor, wrote many of its articles, often concerning a number of his own inventions, earning him the sobriquet of the Scandinavian Da Vinci, Scandinavian Leonardo, I guess it should be, actually. He worked with the great Christopher Polim on the Trollhättan Canal and the docks at Karlskrona. In 1718, during the war between Norway and Sweden, which I think continues in various forms, right, devised the means of moving the Swedish Navy 15 miles across land. He was later appointed an inspector of mines. Nor were Swedenborg's practical activities limited to engineering or mining. He was an active member of the Swedish Diet, contributing his time and energy to matters of state. He also wrote an enormous amount on a variety of subjects, from human anatomy to the Milky Way, in a stately, sober Latin that made no concessions to sensationalism. If you tried to read him, you know that, or anything other than the dry, precise, matter-of-fact relating of his observations. Yet, Swedenborg was a man of the Enlightenment in another way. Although we tend to see it as a time when earlier beliefs, now seen as superstitions, were discarded by men of intelligence and reason, the fact is that the hunger for knowledge that characterized the Enlightenment was not as fastidious as its later epigony claimed. A case in point is Isaac Newton, generally considered one of the architects of the modern world, but who wrote more about alchemy than he did about gravity, which at the time was considered an occult force, given that it could not be seen and provided a spooky action at a distance. Along with imbibing at the springs of science, like many of his time, Swedenborg also absorbed much of what we call the Neoplatonic and Hermetic tradition, the inner esoteric heritage of the West. By the early 17th century, this once prestigious repository of what we can call occult knowledge that is of the unseen, metaphysical, non-material realities, had begun to lose its street cred. But in Swedenborg's time, it still had many devotees, although their position would become increasingly marginal. As I've pointed out in some of my books, the triumph of science and rationalism, which paved the way for our lingering disenchantment, with us now for at least a century, had its roots millennia earlier, in the period the philosopher Karl Jaspers dubbed the Axial Age. This was the time, circa 500 to 800 BC, when the foundations of the world's great moral and ethical beliefs were laid, when the Buddha, Lao Tse, Confucius, Zoroaster, and the Jewish patriarchs appeared and established their influence, which continues today. It's diminished a bit, but it's still around. But in the Greek world, it prompted the rise of the tradition of rational inquiry through the Ionian philosophers who were in search of the fundamental stuff, the basic stuff in which the world was made. This marked a shift from what the German-Swiss philosopher Jean Gebser called the mythic structure of consciousness to the mental, rational one. I'll get on to more slides as we go along. The slides are actually from another talk I gave, similar subjects, so they're not exactly lined up. A shift from seeing the world as mythic to seeing it in terms of rational explanations is one way of expressing its disenchantment. The malaise that Max Weber detected in the early 20th century got its start sometime in the 6th century BC, when Thales of Miletus, no longer satisfied with the mythical account of things, first wondered what was the arche, or primary material of the world around him. We can say that this was a movement from story, to explanation, or as the philosopher of language Owen Barfield and the literary scholar Eric Heller have suggested, from poetry to prose. Yet, while the apologists for disenchantment may argue that this trajectory, whatever its drawbacks, is irreversible, others suggest, as Swedenborg did, that the language of what we might call re-enchantment can be revived. And this is certainly what Swedenborg set out to do. Swedenborg was aware of the power, importance, and benefits of the new way of knowledge. He was also aware of its limitations. It was indeed his scientific pursuit that led him to this. One of the last scientific projects Swedenborg engaged in was to discover the seat of the soul in the human body, an occupation not uncommon at the time. René Descartes, another founder of the modern world, pursued it, anchoring his hopes in the pineal gland, an obscure feature of the brain whose precise function still remains unclear. Yet, try as he might, Swedenborg could not determine how the transition from the physical organ to spiritual reality could be made. A metamorphosis that still eludes us and which is referred to today as the hard problem of consciousness. How qualitative yet immaterial phenomena, thoughts, feelings, intentions, and so on, can be accounted for in terms of quantitative physical ones, neurons and molecules. And this will give you some background to what we're doing here. That's actually a picture of Owen Barfield. I'll mention why he's up there. But speaking of Tolkien, he was a friend of Tolkien's. He was one of the Inklings and used to hang out at the pub in Oxford with C.S. Lewis. He was the great friend of C.S. Lewis. Okay, Swedenborg concluded that one could not arise from the other. The spiritual reality couldn't come from a physical reality. He did not, however, accept, as many thinkers at the time did, that this meant that the so-called spiritual reality simply did not exist. And hence, whatever was associated with it must be accounted for in terms of mere matter. No. He believed that reality was not continuous. That is, not all of a piece, but was characterized by different levels of being. These were not only differences of degree, but also of kind, the essential insight of the increasingly discredited Neoplatonic Hermetic tradition. So that's what we have over here. It's just kind of a general kind of Neoplatonic chain of being, great chain of being of top and the divine. Things get more solid as they lower down to us. And you can find this throughout different traditions. Barfield, like Swedenborg, believed that in earlier times, Swedenborg believed what we're going to get onto, this notion of correspondences between the higher world and the lower world. This was understood at an earlier time. People could actually perceive this. It wasn't an idea, it wasn't a concept. They were able to sort of see things and know that was the case. Similarly, Barfield was a philosopher of language. He wrote a wonderful book in the 1920s called History in English Words. He said, the further back you go in language, it gets more and more poetic. It gets more and more metaphoric. It's more and more evocative. It wasn't the case that it starts out as bare kind of prose and over time became more poetic. It's actually the opposite. We started out a poetic way of speaking in very earlier times and gradually came to a prose way, which is what we have today. Similarly, this is René Schwaller-de-Lubitsch, who was a renegade maverick Egyptologist and alchemist, but he believed that the ancient Egyptians perceived the world in this way as well. And he talked about something called symbolique, which is basically you'd see something in the phenomenal world, a bird or a tree, something like that, and we just see that as a fact. But the ancient Egyptians would know that it had a cosmic context we were talking about earlier. It was related to something higher. So when you saw a rose, it wasn't a rose on a rose, as Gertrude Stein said. It was something very specific in Swedenborg's system, but in generally it evokes something else. Okay, so it was in fact Swedenborg's failure to locate the seat of the soul in the brain, or anywhere else, that led him to abandon science. It was at this point that he underwent a profound change in his life and work. Although some purists like to maintain that Swedenborg's conversion was sudden and unpremeditated, he had in fact for years studied and practiced different forms of meditation and other disciplines designed to effect a change in consciousness. The upshot was that in his mid-50s, Swedenborg suffered several powerful psychic experiences, culminating in a visitation by Christ, who informed him that his destiny did not lie in science, but in communicating the true inner esoteric meaning of Scripture, which had been lost for ages. It was at this point that Swedenborg began to experience the remarkable inner journeys during which angels took him on guided tours of heaven, hell, other planets, and the strange intermediate realm between death and eternity he called the spirit world. That's an early edition of, some years ago, most readable. Swedenborg is never a page turner, but that's the closest you'll get. And the funny thing is that the pictures of the descriptions of heaven that he gives, they're very earthly. Angels live in houses, they have occupations, they get married. Apparently they have sex too, and it's mutually satisfying and continuous. I don't know how they get to work at the same time. But if you read some of the early accounts of life after death, this one by Oliver Lodge, which he wrote after his son was killed in First World War, he describes an afterlife that's very, very much along the same lines. It's a very physical, concrete one, and you can even get a whiskey and soda. There's no monkeys, apparently, in heaven, though, so I don't know why. Elephants were there, but no monkeys. So there we go. And similarly in that book as well. So I'm not saying they copied it, but it's a parallel kind of description of a very concrete, robust kind of heaven. Okay, to be sure, Swedenborg was not the first to embrace the idea that Scripture, like being itself, had different levels of meaning. There we go, okay. The idea goes back to the church fathers Clement and Origen, to Philo the Jew, Ammonius Saccas, and other philosophers and religious teachers of ancient Alexandria. Each in different ways believed that different people could understand Scripture at different levels because their own spiritual development differed. A more recent person in this tradition is the Jungian, then became a student of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, Maurice Nicoll. And he wrote books, The New Man and the Mark, where he gave an esoteric interpretation of Scripture. Some understood it psychologically. Some people could only grasp a literal understanding. Some understood it only psychologically in the sense of a moral message, but others, the most spiritually attuned, could intuit its deepest, most significant meaning, that is symbolically communicating the reality of the divine. This is what Swedenborg undertook with his doctrine of correspondences. He did not, however, limit this only to Scripture. The inner meaning and esoteric reading of Scripture reveals can also be discovered in the phenomenal world, and that of nature, and also the human, man-made world. The phenomenal world was a book, and everything in it had a spiritual meaning. This is what the Nobel Prize-winning author Czesław Miłosz meant when he said that Swedenborg's world is all language. It is, and the language is correspondence. Now, again, the idea that the natural world is somehow symbolic of a higher one is not Swedenborg's alone. It's at the heart of the Hermetic tradition, informing alchemy, astrology, magic, and so on. But it also became a repository of what the early occult historian James Webb called rejected knowledge. And this was a knowledge that was rejected by the new disenchanting tradition, but embraced and defended by the rising opposition to disenchantment, the Romantic poets. William Blake is usually the first name that we think of in this context because he was a devotee of Swedenborg. He later rebelled against him, and you can see how he did that in his book, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where Swedenborg keeps heaven and hell separate. Blake put them together, and he gives the devils the best lines. Another poet, Blake's contemporary Goethe, like Swedenborg, was a scientist, and in Faust, he says all that is transitory is but a symbol. But just to jump ahead, and there's Miłosz, this is Henri Corbin I couldn't mention, but he developed what was called a kind of spiritual hermeneutics, which is along the same line as Swedenborg, and he wrote quite eloquently about Swedenborg himself. But the most influential of these poets to deal with Swedenborg was Baudelaire. Charles Baudelaire, who wrote a poem called Correspondences, but his correspondences are not between a higher realm and this one. They're on a lateral, horizontal level, but between the different senses. And he developed what we know as symbolism. He read about Swedenborg from Balzac. He took the notion of synaesthesia from E.T.A. Hoffmann, where you have different senses, so you hear colors and you see sounds. And he combined that with the notion that Poe had, that the poet is a seer. The poet is a visionary. The poet sees things that ordinary people don't see. And if you know Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, where his detective, Auguste Dupin, is brought in to discover a document that's been stolen. The police can't find it. They've ransacked the culprit's flat, and they can't find anything. The reason they can't find it is that it was left out open on his desk. But the poet can see that. He can see what is ignored by others. So at that point, I won't let you get any closer.
Why not?
And that's, I didn't get to Strindberg, but this is like, again, a kind of narrative of symbolism and how it took over European aesthetic sensibility.
What ideas of Swedenborg remain today among the Church of Swedenborg in England, South Africa, to some extent in Sweden?
Well, they take his teaching as the revelation. The New Age came, I think, 1783.
But he had so many ideas. And
I'm not a Swedenborgian myself. I'm not a member of the Church of Society, so I've written an introductory book to him. But I know when I have given talks there, they ask me questions just like that. And I'm not a card-carrying member, so I don't know exactly. But my impression is that they generally just accept his teachings as the new revelation, the new dispensation.
And he's still inspiring poets and writers?
I imagine so. The Swedenborg Society in London, they hold film festivals, different artistic exhibitions and things of that sort. So they themselves are trying to generate cultural activities on the basis of Swedenborg's work.
Thank you, Gary.
My pleasure.